Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Greg Ashman. Good to see you here. I just thought the talk we had from Stephen Norton was very, very interesting indeed, and links to some of the issues that I will be talking about. What I want to talk about is applying the research on explicit instruction in the classroom. I'll just talk about myself a little bit first and why I would be talking about this topic. So I'm a teacher. I started teaching in 1997. I'm a blogger. I write a blog called Filling the Pail, which is often linked on Twitter and things like that. I'm a writer. I've written an ebook, and I'm also a part-time PhD student. So I'm doing a PhD in an area called cognitive load theory. One of my roles at my current school is head of research, and one of the tasks that I am given is to try and apply research in the context of our school. So my school is a P12 independent school in Victoria, and so I have to go out, look for the research, see how we can do something with that in my school. So it's really putting it into practice, and that's what this talk is partly about. Unfortunately, before we get to putting it into practice, we have to be clear what we mean about explicit instruction. And there are lots of terms that are used that relate to explicit instruction, and they mean slightly different things, and this can be confusing. So you can see the little bubble up there. We've got direct instruction, which is often used as a synonym for explicit instruction, but I tend to avoid it because direct instruction has multiple meanings. Traditional teaching. So, left to their own devices, teachers tend to teach in a fairly didactic, explicit way. But that's not explicit instruction, because explicit instruction has a little bit more to offer than that. DISTAR are a set of programs that were developed by Zig Engelman and his colleagues in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Very, very structured, scripted form of direct instruction. Trialled in Project Follow Through, lots of evidence from that, but that's not quite what I'm talking about. Direct instruction, you'll notice, is up there twice. Once it has lowercase initials, and then the second time it has uppercase initials, because believe it or not, those conventionally mean slightly different things. So direct instruction with the uppercase tends to mean the DISTAR programs, direct instruction lowercase tends to mean explicit instruction. So it's very, very confusing. We also have this term active learning, which people use a lot. And what's interesting is, you might not think it, but the research evidence to support active learning supports explicit instruction. And I'll explain why a little bit later, because those two things are often held in opposition. So this is how I'm going to define explicit instruction. Now, I'm not alone in defining it this way, but this is the one I'm going to use for the purpose of this presentation. So, direct instruction, capital letters, is a very specific program, scripted lessons, Engelman and colleagues. That is a subset of what I would call explicit instruction more generally. I'm following a guy called Barak Rosenshine here in how I'm defining that, although he would call it direct instruction. And then other things that sit outside of that, lecturing, default teacher-led instruction. So what teachers do if they just sort of naturally stand in front of a class and teach isn't quite explicit instruction, calling that default teacher-led explicit instruction, and that sits outside of the definition that I'm going to use. I mentioned Rosenshine earlier, and Rosenshine has written a really important article for something called American Educator. American Educator is the house magazine of the American Federation of Teachers. And it's a brilliant resource because it has articles by world authorities in education that are fully referenced. So there are articles by people like John Sweller, E.D. Hirsch, various other people. They're fully referenced, so you can chase down those references if you want to, but they are written with a teacher audience in mind. And one of the pieces that Rosenshine has written for American Educator is called Principles of Instruction. And it's basically an outline of what is meant by explicit instruction and what I'm going to be talking about in terms of explicit instruction. And there are the principles in summary, which I'm just going to give you a moment to read through. So those are the principles that Rosenshine has come up with, and those are the principles that we try and enact in my school. So I've mentioned that I'm partly responsible for trying to get the research enacted in our school, and one of the things that we do is we try and build these principles into our unit planning, into our lesson planning. Now there is a danger here, a really important danger, which I'm going to come onto in a minute or two, and it links a lot to what Stephen Norton was saying about just learning rules as opposed to understanding why the rules work. It absolutely links to that. So I will talk about that danger in a little while. But these are the principles that he outlines. And some really important things in there that I would just pick out. Notice bullet point 3, ask a large number of questions. So it's highly interactive. This is not a one-way lecture. Yes, so what I'm doing now, a bit of a one-way lecture, that's not explicit instruction, according to these principles. Look at the bullet point that says obtain a high success rate. I think he says something like about 80% of students' responses you want them to be correct. Now, why? Well, I'm going to come to where these principles came from in a minute, but there are very important reasons for this to do with students' sense of self-efficacy. If success builds success, if students feel that they're getting better at something, there is an element of that that is motivating. So where do Rosenshine's principles come from? Rosenshine's principles come from a body of research usually called process product research. And it is essentially correlational. So those of you, like me, who are into their educational experiments might think, oh, correlation is not causation. I'm not sure what we can draw from this. But it's a very large body of research conducted from the 1950s through to the 1970s, roughly, where researchers went into classrooms with clipboards, various scoring systems, scored different teacher behaviours. And then what they tried to do is they tried to link the different teacher behaviours to student test score gains. So the difference in the test scores at the start and the end of a period of instruction. And then they tried to correlate the factors that seemed to be associated with the largest test score gains. And this is where Rosenshine gets these principles from. So it could be, given that correlation is not causation, it could be that there is some other reason that causes teachers to do one of these things that also causes their students to do better, and it's not actually the particular principle that causes the students to do better. But I think that there's such a large body of evidence on this that we should be paying attention to what it says. A really good resource, if you have the time to plough through it, is a systematic review by Thomas Brophy and his colleague, and I don't know how to say his first name, but his surname is Good. And you can get it, the whole thing, as a PDF on the internet, and it's a summary of basically the whole swathe of this process product research with much more nuance than I'm able to convey in this short presentation. Jeanne Shaw also draws on this in her book, The Academic Achievement Challenge, which I'm going to refer to later. I was lucky enough a few years ago, my school sent me to a conference in Cincinnati, the International Congress for School Effectiveness and Improvement. And I got to hear Thomas Good speak. And I think he's a professor emeritus now, and he was reflecting back as Professor Emeritus, I don't know how to say that, tend to do. And he was reflecting back on his career and some of the things that he'd worked on. And he came up with this list, again, which kind of mirrors Rosenshine's list. It's based on the process product research of the features of the teachers that were more effective in that research. So I'll give you a moment to have a look at that. And again, a few features that I would highlight. Opportunity to learn is often this concept that's been measured quite a lot by researchers in classroom, academic learning time. It's what Stephen Norton was referring to, that he was trying to gauge through student surveys. So how much time are you actually spending working hard in a classroom as opposed to doing other things, or your mind wandering? A balance of procedural and conceptual knowledge. Teacher clarity, enthusiasm and warmth. And this thing that's become quite popular, particularly in the UK at the moment, I believe, the idea of teaching to mastery. So Benjamin Bloom did a lot of work on mastery back in the 50s, I think. But it's become very popular recently because people have gone to places like Singapore and they said, oh, well, they use a mastery approach. So what does that look like? And the idea is that you have to obtain a very high success rate in a particular area before you move on to the next set of concepts. So all these things are quite linked because they'll remind you of what I just said about Rosenshine. But here's the danger, and this is the danger for trying to apply these principles in your school and in your practice. You can't simply give teachers a list like this or a list like this and say, go and do that. You can't do that. It's not effective. And this is the reason why. Teaching is a complex domain. There are lots of things that are happening when you're teaching. I don't know, if you tried to code them all, you could probably come up with 100 factors, 150 factors, 200 factors that you could code for in a classroom. So all these lists can ever do is sample some of them. Say, well, good teachers tend to do this, tend to do that, tend to do this. It won't capture everything that good teachers do. Or the more, I say good teachers, the more effective teachers according to this research. And your danger is by highlighting those features. This is, by the way, this is the identical problem that we have with rubrics for scoring writing. So when students do a piece of writing, that is also a complex domain. You can identify all sorts of things about a piece of writing that you could record, but when you create a rubric, you identify particular features. And what we've done here is we've identified particular features of teaching. The problem then becomes that people replicate the features without replicating the whole thing. Now, a very good example of this, early in my career, back in, I said it was 1997, I started training, so I started as a fully fledged teacher in 1998. It was, you must write your lesson objectives on the board at the start of it. You must write these lesson objectives on the board, very important lesson objectives. Write them on the board, everyone has to do it. So senior leaders would come around, they'd tick off, yes, he's written the lesson, yes, that's a good thing. No one knew why they were doing it. They just knew it was something that they had to do. And you could go around the classrooms and they would be of varying quality. No one could really explain to you that what they were trying to do was make explicit to the students the purpose of the lesson. Now, the idea of writing learning objectives on the board is a very good one if you're trying to communicate to the students what you want them to learn in that lesson. You're trying to make those things explicit. But if you don't have that understanding, it just becomes a routine. And of course, there are other ways that you can make the purpose of the lesson explicit to the student without writing things on the board. So by taking one of these features, and that probably does originate in the process product research, that idea of writing lesson objectives on the board, but it's also, I know it's something that was pushed in the UK through assessment for learning and programs like that. That probably does originate in the process product research, but if you do it without understanding why you're doing it, you end up with this danger of replicating the features. And so part of my role, one of the things that I'm very keen on, is talking to teachers about the research and trying to get them to discuss it, take it on board, synthesize it, all the things that we would do with students if we wanted them to understand a complex domain. You have to do with teachers around this sort of research. Otherwise, the risk is that they will just try and do the things that it says on the list without really understanding why they're doing them. And in fact, this was something that Thomas Good was very strong in cautioning us about when he spoke at the ICSE conference, that you can take a list like this. He was almost reluctant to give us this list. He was almost reluctant to give it us because of that danger of just getting people to replicate those features. So what we really need to do is develop an understanding of what explicit instruction is. There is quite a lot of evidence, which I'm just going to summarize for you briefly. I'm just going to check the time. There is quite a lot of evidence for explicit instruction. So why would you listen to Rosenstein? Why would you try and apply these principles in your lessons? Well, there's quite a lot of evidence, and I'm going to briefly go through that. One study that it always surprises me that people don't know about. Just out of interest, raise your hand if you've heard of Project Follow Through before today. Okay, so that's a few of you, but it is the largest experiment in educational history, the most expensive experiment in educational history. So even if we don't think it shows very much, it should be something that we should know about. It was a part, it sits within the process product research, but it's a slightly different design in that people call it a horse race. So at the end of the 60s in America, the Lyndon B. Johnson government was investing money in something called Head Start, which was a preschool program. They wanted to extend it into early years of education. The Congress cut the funding, so they couldn't do what they actually wanted to do. So instead they decided to do an experiment. So with the much reduced funding, they put these ideas into different schools to see what would happen. So some organisations, Bank Street, were maybe given a school to try their model in, and another organisation was given a different school to try their model in. And Zig Engelman, and I think it's Wesley Becker and a few others, they were given schools to try their model in. And their model, if you remember back to the start, was this scripted direct instruction program. People, by the way, often misconstrue the idea behind the scripting. I think that they didn't set out with the intention of scripting the lessons for direct instruction, but they just found it was the only way to keep the teachers delivering what they wanted them to deliver, because even they tended to go off track. And again, this is this idea of people maybe don't understand the fundamental reasons for some of the things that we're asking them to do. So if you look at that research, DISTAR is clearly the most effective. Now, it's not just the most effective of all the approaches in that study. It was unfortunately named a basic skills model because that's what it targets. So direct instruction targets things like, probably we wouldn't call it the optimal phonics instruction now, but a form of explicit phonics instruction, number facts, number basics. But what they found is that when they assess these students on a battery of measures, that these students outperform the others on reading comprehension and on problem solving. So although the approach was to teach basic skills, it didn't just improve basic skills, it improved these things that we think of as higher order. And it also did things like it improved student self-esteem better than programs that explicitly set out to improve student self-esteem, which I think is quite worth thinking about. Now, there is a lot of controversy over Project Follow Through. If you can imagine a big study like that, it was messy. It's not how you design a study if you wanted to do it in a lab. There's confounds, there's numbers of people in rooms weren't kept the same and all this sort of stuff. So if you want to, you can argue it away. And there's another bit of analysis, the high scope studies, which were done years later that looked to try and follow up students who'd had the intervention known as high scope versus the students who had DISTAR, and they sort of cast a bit of doubt on the program, but I think personally that those criticisms have been quite comprehensively answered by people like Rica, who was involved in the original. But anyway, so the point is, there's a lot in Project Follow Through, very big study, very expensive, found some very clear findings, we can argue about them, quite controversial. So we can't go on Project Follow Through alone as our evidence base, but there's plenty of other evidence. So people have tried to do the same sort of process product research all over the place. There's a Mausch, that's how you say that, by the way. I went to a conference and I met some people from the Netherlands and they told me that's how you say it. It's Mausch. Mausch and Reynolds. So they did some British, they looked at, some British process product studies. We've got the Oracle study. Now this is really interesting. This is really interesting from how it's framed. Just check the time. Teachers labelled class inquirers showed greatest gains in maths and language. So again, process product research. So what do you think class inquirers look like? Well, it sounds like a sort of constructivist type pedagogy, doesn't it? Class inquirers, that set up inquiry, and the students would figure things out, and then you sort of ask them questions and engage in dialogue. But actually, these class inquirers spent 4 times as much time using whole class interactive teaching than the least effective group of teachers. So it's an interesting name to call them. I would call that explicit instruction, because that's what it sounds like to me. And various other studies, some European studies that also sort of confirmed, weekly the same findings. And this quote, this is from Mash and Reynolds' book, Effective Teaching, Evidence and Practice, very good book that. A crucial part of the direct instruction lesson is interactive questioning. So if I achieve one thing today with this presentation, is that none of you will leave the room thinking that a lecture is explicit instruction. So lecturing is one way. It's what I'm doing now, it's me talking to you. That's not explicit instruction. If it was explicit instruction, I'd be down there and I'd be asking you as many questions as I'd be saying things to the room. Interestingly, these findings have also been replicated in strategy instruction. So strategy instruction is things like teaching students reading comprehension skills, or teaching them strategies for writing a narrative piece of writing or a persuasive piece of writing. Teaching them strategies for mathematical problem-solving skills. Now, I'm not a huge fan of strategy instruction, because my view is that most of the time it's better to build things up from the base. However, there is a lot of evidence for these sort of intermediate level strategies that work at a slightly more meta level, and there's actually quite a lot of evidence for them. If you ever hear or read Dan Willingham talk about reading comprehension strategies, he says something which I will paraphrase as that they work. Teaching kids reading comprehension strategies, such as asking yourself questions while you're reading a text, that works. However, students need very little instruction in it to get the benefits. They only need a short amount of instruction in reading comprehension strategies to get those benefits. And if you keep practicing them over and over and over, you get no additional benefits. And that, therefore, his view is that we overemphasize things like reading comprehension strategies in schools, things like guided reading sessions. We practice and practice these things, whereas we can actually get the benefit there. It's worthwhile having, it's worthwhile teaching these strategies, but you can get the benefit quite quickly, and then you don't get more returns on top of that. However, setting all that discussion about strategy instruction aside, it turns out that the best way of delivering strategy instruction is through explicit instruction. So when they've done the research, looked at the different ways of teaching students about these strategies, explicit instruction seems to be the best way to go. This is all correlational. No, actually, some of the strategy instruction stuff is experimental. Sorry, so that's not right. The people set out with the deliberate intention of teaching these strategies in their own experiments. But the process product research was largely correlational. So looking at correlations between teacher behaviours and their effectiveness. But there is other evidence from multiple sources that seem to triangulate the idea that explicit instruction is effective, which is one of the reasons that I think we should be giving it a good hard look. It's not just one corner of research that shows the effectiveness of explicit instruction. It keeps popping up in different forms when you look at things in different ways. Some of it is negative. So the first trial up there is a randomized controlled trial in Costa Rica. They wanted to improve, I think it was maths teaching in Costa Rica, and they came up with various interventions based on the use of technology and students constructing their own meanings and all that sort of thing. And they actually found that the control condition was the most effective, which is where they didn't give the students any of those interventions, which I think is quite telling, because that control condition would not have been, I imagine, optimal explicit instruction. It would be more like default teacher-led instruction. So it's interesting that that didn't work out for them. Then I think there are also some really useful data. I'm going to talk about PISA again in a minute, because I've actually added a little bit of flesh to the PISA point. But data from TIMSS seems to, there was a study done a few years ago that showed that science teachers who used what was called a lecture style, again, I'm not advocating lecturing, but who used a lecture style, tended to be associated with higher scores in TIMSS than those teachers who used lots of group work and things like that. There's some interesting data in PISA 2012 about maths teaching as well that shows you, sorry, I'll come to that. There was a study where researchers asked principals in Denmark for their views on the most effective ways to teach, and those who basically endorsed the idea of teachers standing at the front of the room explaining things to students, asking them questions. Their schools, on whatever measure they used, tended to be more effective than the principals who endorsed more of a student-centred model. The other bit, which I'll briefly touch on, I'll come back to this in a minute, but the worked example effect is the cornerstone of a field called cognitive load theory, which I'm actually involved in. My PhD research sort of sits within the field of cognitive load theory, but almost the foundational research for that is this worked example effect, where students who studied worked examples of how to solve simple algebra problems outperformed students who had to sort of try and solve the problems themselves and work out how to solve them. And this provides evidence for guidance, the idea that if we give students guidance, they will tend to do better than if we ask them to work out their own strategies for solving problems. I'm going to flesh out the PISA a little bit now. I'll give you a chance to read that. So this is really interesting. PISA, Programme for International Student Assessment, run by the OECD. They actually define good teaching. I found a definition somewhere. I'm not sure they call it good or effective teaching or something. They define it as being student orientated. So they've actually said this is what good teaching is. This is the definition of student orientated. These are the things that student orientated teaching looks like according to PISA. Now you might agree or disagree. You might say, well, that's not student orientated, or it is, or I'd add something else. Basically, that doesn't matter for this argument. This is what PISA thinks it is. A student orientation. That's what they think it is. And they have backed this horse. They have said, this is what we think effective instruction is. But their own data shows that it is negatively associated with achievement. Now, I don't normally read out my slides, but just for dramatic effect, I'm going to read out this quote. Student-orientated instruction was negatively related to mathematics performance in every education system. So the more of it you had, the worse the maths performance. You should be able to see that their definition of student-orientated, teacher-student orientation conflicts with what we've been talking about in terms of explicit instruction. So I don't want to be accused of drawing a false dichotomy or something unforgivable like that. But I do think that this doesn't sit. You couldn't call this explicit instruction. This is, if you like, the opposite of explicit instruction, and it doesn't work very well. This is Jean Chol. I hope I've said that right. I've said this too many times now, and I hate it when people pronounce people's names wrong, but I've never actually figured that one out. This is a quote from her book that I mentioned earlier, The Academic Achievement Challenge. So I'll give you a chance to read that. Now, I hesitate to put that up because once you introduce a word like traditional, you set the cat amongst the pigeons. I think less important of her use of the word traditional is what she means by it. And if you see what she's saying the teacher assumes direction, for example, letting students know what is to be learned and explaining how to learn it, concentrating on tasks, correcting errors, and rewarding of activities. So that sits within Rosenshine Good's ideas of explicit instruction. So that's what we mean here. And that is associated. And for a bit of context, Jean Chaw spent many years working on reading instruction and repeatedly proving that systematic synthetic phonics, which it wasn't even called when she first started researching it, was more effective than other approaches at teaching reading. So this is where she's coming from. This is an interesting study. So I often find that if you want to look at what's really going on, the underlying mechanisms, a good place to go is research into special education. I don't think that students with learning difficulties learn in a completely different way to students who don't have those learning difficulties. And I think that when we find effective ways for teaching students with learning difficulties, we're actually finding what the most effective teaching strategies are. This is a really good example. I like it because it's an ABC design, which I've been onto. Well, I've been trying to get the EEF and E4L in Australia to back more of these, where you run two interventions against control. So if you run an intervention against a control, invariably the intervention works, because, as Hattie would say, everything in education works. But if you run two interventions against control, you get to see which one works best. And you had standard maths lessons versus standard maths lessons with a constructivist intervention. So this is where teachers say, well, what strategy did you use to solve this? And how, I'm running out of time, so I won't go into too much detail. Standard maths lesson plus an explicit intervention. Both of the interventions outperform the control, but the explicit intervention outperformed the constructivist intervention. I'm running out of time, so This is a very, very brief introduction to cognitive load theory. Basically, our memory, this is obviously an oversimplification, but it's a nice little heuristic. That our memory consists of a working memory, which is highly constrained, and a long-term memory, which is effectively limitless. And these components we have to take into account when we are designing instruction. However, when we have lots of stuff in our long-term memory, the constraints in the working memory essentially disappear, and we can process a lot more. So this is why in the age of Google we still need to put stuff in our long-term memory, because it makes us much more efficient at problem solving and things like that. That's cognitive load theory very briefly. I'm running out of time. There are some limitations to explicit instruction. People say, well, perhaps they learn it better if they figure things out themselves. Cloran-Nigham's study tends to suggest that that's not the case. Students who learned a principle through discovery learning were no better at applying it to new contexts than students who've been explicitly taught it. Do they gain non-cognitive skills, collaborative skills, things like that from approaches other than explicit instruction? Maybe. Not a huge amount of evidence on that. I would say also, and I think this is the most powerful thing, you don't want kids to go to school and do the same thing every lesson, all day, every day. So even if you found the most effective way of teaching, it would be ineffective if that's what you did every single lesson. So I think there's an argument for variety. There's an argument for kids doing bits of project work or doing other things. As long as we don't suggest that those things are more effective than explicit instruction, we know that we're adding them in there for a reason, to give a balanced program, to give a variety to the student's experience. This is what I thought when I came out of teacher education. I thought that it was really bad if teachers tried to fill kids up with stuff. I've changed my mind on that. And finally, if you should wish to do so, that's my ebook where I go into a bit more detail on some of these things. If you go to my website, my blog site, gregashman.wordpress.com, you can download it. Thank you very much. We might have time for one question. I did go to 2 minutes. Has anyone got one? Burning question?